If you have been following extreme programming, you would have definitely come across test driven development. And in this video, we are going to try out test driven development in Mule using Munit 2.0. So, a test driven development has three phases, which is the red green refactor approach. It starts with red, which is step 1, with writing a failing test case, and then you have to go back to your actual code where the logic resides and write just enough code to pass the failing test. Once the test case passes, it becomes green, and once it becomes green, you are good to refactor if you want to improve the quality of code, like improving some business logic. So let's try out this approach in Mule. So to demonstrate TDD, I have a scenario. The scenario is that there is a customer. He could either be prime or non-prime. If the customer is prime customer, he has to see the list of prime products. If he is non-prime customer, he sees a list of non-prime products. So if you can see, there are two tables. One is user and the other one is products. User has details of the user like ID, first name, last name, and its prime status. Same is the case with products. Even it has the details of prime or non-prime and the other details about the product. So we'll be using this example to demonstrate TDD. So the idea is the request would come an HTTP request, and it would have the customer ID in the form of query parameters. So let's get started. So I've already opened up a project and a, a test suite, but it's all blank right now. So let's add a test case. Test. Okay. Now in execution, let me add a flow reference to call some flow which has the logic. Okay, flow reference. So let's configure this flow reference. Now there is an error over here. It says attribute name is required, the flow name is required. Let's see. Okay, so this is not working, and the first rule is that compile time errors are error, and before moving forward we need to fix the compile time error. We cannot run this test case unless and until we get rid of this compile time error. So since there is no flow in this XML, it's obvious that we are going to get this compile time error. So let's add a flow to get rid of that error. Okay, so we have added the flow. Now let's see if we can get rid of this error. And there it is, we have the flow and the compile time error is gone. Now in validation, first we would be passing the first scenario. In this scenario we won't be passing any customer ID, or it's as good as passing it as null or some invalid ID. The valid IDs were 1, 2 and 3. If you see the database, the IDs are 1, 2 and 3, but we do not want to get the customer. We'll pass some invalid ID, or we won't even pass the ID. So for that, if no data is found in the database, the output that a select palette would give you is a blank array. So we expect a blank array. So let's use assert equals. Okay, let's change the version. assert. Let me add it here. So what do we want to assert? We want to check if the payload is a blank array, right? Since we'll pass an invalid customer ID, we are bound to get a blank array. So now let's try to run this and see if it works. So as you can see, the test case has failed, and the error that has come out is there was one error while parsing the given file TDD mule.xml. Okay, it says the content of element flow is not complete. So it's obvious we didn't add any processor to this flow, and by definition of a flow it should have at least one processor to be a valid flow. So we need to add a processor so that it works. But even if we add any processor, it's going to fail. So we need to add a valid processor. I mean, we need to add some logic to it so that it ultimately passes the test case. So now let's start with the logic over here. So I'll use a select query. So let's add a select over here. There it is. And for this select would be getting the details from the query parameters. Before that, we need to configure the connector. So let's configure it. So it's generic connection and the JDBC driver. Let me add the URL. org .h2 .driver, username is SA. So we also need to add the driver. Let's add the driver. I'll be using a local file which I have it. The desktop, yeah, here it is. Okay, okay, so I have configured the connector. Now let's enter the query. It's select. What do you want to select? Select the prime status, right? Select prime from, what was the table name? It was users. So select prime from users, where now this ID would be dynamic. So I'll add a placeholder for it, and let's configure the placeholder. Okay, so it's dw2.o output be application Java id is the placeholder, and this would be populated using the query parameter. So from attributes dot query params dot id. So this is how we'll get the id. Let's click on done. Now the output that's going to come is in the form of object. So let's transform it. Let's transform it to a JSON. Then map it to this payload. Okay, so the payload would get converted into JSON. So that's it for this flow. Let's try to run the test, and hopefully it should be green. So as you can see, we have successfully cleared this test case, and from red phase it has come to a green phase. Okay, so we have completed this test case, but now let's think about refactoring the code. Okay, so since this is an API, this would ultimately become an API. So having a blank array being returned to the end user is not a good idea, right? We should have some sensible message. So as a part of this refactoring activity, we would like to give a sensible error message back. Okay, so we'll start it off with a new test case. So what we'll do is we'll change this test. Okay, I would want to assert instead of assert. I'll remove this and I'll use an assert that. I want to read it from some file. Assert that, and the payload that would come is should be equal to I'll add a sample JSON that has to be retrieved. Let me add a sample JSON. Okay, go to let's name this file as error.json. Finish. Now let me add a message to it. So message would be something like customer does not exist. It's just a message. Okay, customer does not exist. So this is what we should expect. Let's go back to the test suite, and Munit tools has this equal to, and in equal to we want to fetch the JSON. So it has an implicit function called read URL. We'll be using that, and since this error.json is in a class path, let's write class path / error.json. So the error.json file would be retrieved and it would be compared against the payload, and if both are same, our unit test case would pass. So let's run and see if this works. So if it is, obviously it's going to fail because we haven't changed or refactored our logic. So we'll go back to the first stage where we would be failing this test case. So it should fail now. Let's see. Yeah, so there it is, a failed test case. Now we want to pass this test case, right? So what are we going to do is, since select is for this point of time, select is going to throw return a blank array. So we are looking to raise an error. So let's raise an error. And before that, let me just remove this transform. We don't need this. I'm just interested in raising an error. So let's raise an error, and let me raise a custom error. So it's like customer colon not found, something of this sort. Okay, and in description, let's add the description. Okay, leave it. We don't need a description. We'll just go ahead with the error type. And now we need to propagate this error. Okay, so let's propagate on error propagate. Okay, so now we have this on error propagate, and here we'll set but let's configure what type of error we are looking at. Let me just copy and paste customer not found. Okay, so it will catch only customer not found errors. So now let's add a transform over here, and return a JSON, and the JSON should be like this. So let's copy and paste it. This is what we are expecting, right? Okay, so let's try to run this and see what happens. So the test case has failed. So let's try to understand why did the test case fail. Okay, but before that, let's see what all got executed. You can see green ticks, so this got executed, this got executed, and it did come to the on error propagate, and the transform message also got executed. But why we didn't receive the error message? Let's see the console. If you see the console, an error occurred, it's written over here. Okay, and we are getting the error, but we are not getting the payload. So there's a thing going on over here that when it hits the flow reference goes and encounters an error. Okay, so when it encounters an error, the flow stops then and there itself. It doesn't move to this validation part. So since it doesn't move to the validation part, it's not working, right? So for this scenario, let's let's change the scenario. I'll keep this assert that for some other condition, but let's just remove it, or maybe we can let it be, but it's never going to reach here, right now in this point of time. It's not going to reach here. So the exception, we need to catch it, and we need to change it like the way we used to do in JUnit, add expected exception. So that's how. So just click on this flow. Okay, and here we can write the expected exception. So we cannot see, but custom exception, but we can add it. We can copy it from here. What customer colon not found. So let's copy this and let's try to add it over here. So this is the expected error. So now when the flow comes over here, the flow reference goes, hits the actual flow, all the processes get executed, and then it comes back. It is supposed to catch the exception and check if it is as per the expected error. So now this is going to pass. Okay, let's see, let's run, and this assert that is not going to execute, so we can remove it. But let's run it first and see if the test case pass. It takes some time. So we have encountered an error, and see, it has captured the error, right? It has caught. Now what if I delete this? I can happily delete it. Let's put it okay, let's just delete it right away. And now let's test. And as you can see, even after removing the assert, that it's working. So what do we conclude over here? We conclude that it doesn't go to the validation, the exception occurs and the flow captures it. So, and since we said that we should expect the error as customer colon not found, it has caught the error. Now what we'll do is we'll add the assert that condition to the next test case. Okay, so let's do that. Let's write a new test case. Let's add a new test. Here it is. Now let's add a flow reference. Flow reference. Let's call the flow using this flow reference and use the assert that to assert what's gonna come. Okay, But okay, let's configure, then we'll discuss. Payload and equal to equal to let's read URL, and let's point this read URL to the file that's placed in a class path. So the file name is error.json. So now the flow reference, there's no point of having this flow reference right here. The reason, we are expecting a HTTP response which has to be sent. So the flow reference would not be able to give us, even if it is able to come back to the test case, it's going to be an error, and the flow would never go to this assert that. So for that thing to happen, we have to add an HTTP listener. But before that, I have to remove this flow reference. Let's just get rid of this flow reference and add a requester instead, because the requester would be able to return back the exception code, which would be 404 because it's not found, and with a sensible message. So let's add a requester and configure this requester. So host would be, as usual, local host, and port would be 8085. All right. Okay. And path forward slash. So that's it. We have configured the HTTP requester. Now let's add a listener over here, so that it would come to this flow. Let's create a configuration. It's 8085. Okay. Path is forward slash. Okay. So everything looks good, but the idea was, in TDD it should first fail, right? So let's see. So there it is. It has failed. But let's see the reason. So the exception came up. The exception came up. I believe it's for the first test case. So first test case has passed. The second one has failed. Okay, so let's see why the second one has failed. Okay, so if you see over here, if you see the error, it says that get on resource failed because service is unavailable. So what exactly happened over here? It would have passed, but no, it wouldn't have passed right now. Even if we got rid of this error, there's something we need to fix other than this as well. So why does this error come? The reason behind this is, whenever your test case starts, okay, by default it mocks the source endpoints. Okay, so in this case, this listener was not active. It was mocked. So you can specify that mock, you can modify it, but this was mocked, so it didn't, the service was not even up. So when it goes to search for localhost colon 8085, it doesn't get that URL, it doesn't respond. So that's the reason we are getting 5 of 3. So how do we fix this? To fix this, just click on this flow, and what you have to do is enable flow sources. You have to enable the source so that the listener could fetch the request. So once we enable it, what would happen is the request would go over here. But there is yet another problem. Now if there is an error, that would be propagated back as an error, and again it would block, it won't reach the assert that. So what we'll do is, let's pass an error code 404. I haven't configured the error code, so let me add a variable. Let's configure a variable, and status code should be the name. Let's keep it as status code. Okay, and let's remove this 404. 404 is the status code that we are going to return back. Okay, and in listener, let's configure the responses. In error response, I'll return the payload. That's what I want. Okay, and the next thing what I want is the status code. So the status code would be where's dot status code, or else default it to 500. Okay, so we have configured this, we have enabled the flow sources, but there's one more thing that we need to do. 404 is by default would be considered as a failure, so again it won't reach this assert that. Since we want it to reach the assert that, we need to modify this. We need to add a response validator and say success status code validator, and let's add a 404 over here. The reason, because we know that in this case 404 we are considering it as success. It's not a success, but since we want to assert the payload that's coming, let's consider 404 as a success code, and let's try to run this. Let's see if it passes the test case or fails the test case. So as you can see, we have cleared both the test cases, right? Now what we can do is, let's add something. Let me add one more. Let's test the status code over here. So let's add an assert equals, and let's test the status code. I think there's bug with this Anypoint Studio. I don't know, it asks again and again. Okay, let's add assert equals. Actual is attributes dot status code, and expected is 404, right? So let's run and see. It should pass. So again, we have passed the test case and it has asserted the status code and the expected error message. Okay, so that's it for this video. We definitely will continue this because this is just the halfway through the journey. There's even more thing. We are yet to get a valid customer and a list of valid products, right? So it's pending, but since the video is going long, let's divide this into two parts. So that's it for this video. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.